What might have changed in the brain to afford the new kind of cognition that could create art, symbols, perhaps syntax or music? Since brains don't leave very useful fossils, we have to go on what skulls can tell us. If the change happened at the level of microscopic neural connectivity or changes in processing at the level of dendrites, we might not be able to discover what changed in the brain based on changes in skull shape. But it might be the best we have to go on for now, at least until genetic approaches advance to a point where we can infer changes in neural circuit structure from changes in DNA. So let's look at skulls. If you look at a chimp, it lacks much of a forehead, at least compared to us. Nonetheless, chimps have pretty amazing memory capacities. In this experiment, done by Tetsuro Matsuzawa and his colleagues in Japan, I'm not sure whether the chimp here is using working memory or some kind of eidetic memory, but in either case, it's performing better than most humans would on this task. It's remembering the positions and numbers and touching them in the right sequence, even after they're offset. Clearly, chimps have a pretty huge short-term memory capacity. So it's unlikely that what sets us apart cognitively and behaviorally from a chimp is just memory capacity. It has to be something else. What could that be? Let's look at skulls from our lineage. Here you can see a Homo erectus from perhaps 1 million years ago in front, a Homo heidelbergensis from perhaps 600,000 years ago in the middle, and a Neanderthal in back from perhaps 50,000 years ago. Not only were brains getting bigger, the frontal lobes were getting disproportionately bigger, as evidenced by larger and less sloping foreheads. But now, here you can compare a member of our species with our nearest relative, the Neanderthals. Clearly, you can see how much bigger the forehead is in a modern human. In this graph, you can see how our brains increase in size over time. On the y-axis is brain volume in cubic centimeters, or cc. On the x-axis is time in millions of years, where each unit on the x-axis represents 100,000 years. Whereas Australopithecine brains were only a little larger than chimp brains, Homo habilis, the maker of the Oldowan tools, had a brain 50% bigger than Australopithecine brains. But Homo erectus represented something of a quantum leap in brain size relative to Homo habilis. By the time we get to Neanderthals, represented by the rectangular section on the right, we have brains that were really big, some as big as 1700 cc, but on average about 1450 cc, which is substantially larger than the modern human average of about 1350 cc. And yet, Neanderthals were not especially innovative or apparently imaginative. When I look at a Neanderthal brain endocast compared to a modern human brain, what I notice is that their posterior brain seems widened and flattened relative to ours. This might imply that they dedicated relatively more neural processing to vision, spatial processing, motion processing, and perhaps attentional processing. And their forebrains are relatively smaller than ours, suggesting that we may have more complex capacities in the domains of executive control and working memory. Quite amazingly, a recent study looked at a large number of modern Europeans in search of differences in brains among those with more brain-related genes derived from Neanderthals versus those with fewer such genes, also known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. In this lovely diagram, on the left, you can see in orange those areas where skull morphometry in modern humans who have Neanderthal brain-related SNPs are relatively different than average humans. This is in those visual, spatial, and motion processing areas I was talking about a minute ago. And on the right, you can see in red areas where Neanderthals were relatively larger than modern humans, and in green, areas where they were relatively smaller or more contracted than modern humans. Or conversely, green here represents areas where our brains are disproportionately larger than Neanderthal brains. But let's not just compare our brain with that of a Neanderthal. Let's compare our brain with that of a chimp. Well, our brains are much bigger, so let's normalize a chimp brain to be the same volume as ours. Imagine blowing up a chimp brain to 3 times its volume, so that it matches the volume of a modern human brain. If we do that, we can look for areas of our brain that are relatively larger or smaller compared to such a normalized chimp brain. Here you can see a graph of such a comparison. Most areas of the brain are proportionately smaller in our brain, except the frontal lobes, which are more than twice as large as they would be expected to be if all we had was a larger version of a chimp brain. So something special happened in our lineage that had to do with the executive control, planning, and working memory circuitry found in the frontal lobes, also known as prefrontal cortex. Note, all mammals have prefrontal cortex. If we define this as those areas of cortex that receive and send projections to and from a particular nucleus of the thalamus, called the mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus, we can see that even a cat or a dog has prefrontal cortex. If we think of the frontal lobes, so defined, as areas involved in self-governance, executive control, planning, and working memory, well, even a cat or dog can do these things to some degree. But what happened in us is a virtual explosion of this circuitry. It's likely that the expansion of this circuitry played a central role in the emergence of our kinds of minds, certainly relative to a cat or dog or chimp, or even relative to a Neanderthal. It was likely changes in neural circuitry in the frontal lobes that afforded us our capacities for self-governance and imagination, art, thinking, and perhaps even music and language. As I mentioned before, our massive foreheads and frontal lobes might be analogous to the peacock's tail of our lineage.